The gunshot cracked through the warehouse, and Daniel Moretti did not flinch. He stood over the man kneeling on the concrete floor, his hands tied behind his back, sweat dripping down his face in the cold night air. Daniel lowered his arm slowly, the weapon still warm in his hand, his eyes empty of any emotion. This was not the first time he had done this, and it would not be the last. 10 years of running his father's empire had taught him one lesson above all others. Mercy was a weakness that got people killed. He turned away from the kneeling man and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing against the metal walls. Behind him, 2 of his men moved forward to finish what needed to be finished. Daniel did not look back. He never did. Outside, the night air was sharp and cold against his face. He pulled his coat tighter and walked to his car, a black sedan parked at the edge of the lot. His driver, a quiet man named Peter, opened the door for him without a word. Daniel slid into the back seat and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the silence wrap around him like a blanket. This was his life now. Meetings in warehouses, debts collected in blood, a name that made grown men shake when they heard it spoken. Daniel Moretti had built all of this from the ashes of his father's death, and he had built it with a coldness that surprised even himself. His father had been murdered 10 years ago, shot 3 times in the back of his own restaurant by a man he had trusted for over a decade. Daniel had been 22 years old, barely finished with college, when the call came that changed everything. He remembered standing in the hospital hallway, his mother sobbing into his shoulder, and feeling something inside him shut off like a light switch. From that day forward, he stopped being the boy who wanted to study business and open his own company. He became the man who took over his father's organization and made sure nothing like that ever happened to his family again. The car pulled onto the highway, city lights blurring past the window. Daniel thought about his father often, especially at night, when the work was done, and his mind had nothing else to focus on. He thought about the man who had pulled the trigger, a man named Victor Lang, who had disappeared without a trace, the same night the murder happened. For 10 years, Daniel had searched for him quietly, using every resource his organization had, but Victor had vanished like smoke. Some of Daniel's men believed he was dead. Daniel refused to believe that. A man like Victor did not simply disappear. He was hiding, waiting, watching. And someday, Daniel would find him. The car stopped outside a small restaurant on the edge of downtown, a place with warm yellow lights glowing through the windows, and the smell of fresh bread drifting into the street. Daniel had been coming here for the past few weeks, though he could not explain to himself exactly why. It was not the kind of place his organization would need. It was small, quiet, family-owned, the kind of restaurant that had no connection to his world at all. Maybe that was exactly why he kept coming back. He stepped inside, and the warmth hit him first, followed by the smell of garlic and roasted tomatoes. A woman looked up from behind the counter and smiled, the kind of smile that seemed to come naturally to her, without effort or pretense. Her name was Elena Marsh, and she owned this restaurant with her older brother, though most nights she was the only one running the place. She had dark hair pulled back loosely, flour dusted on her apron, and eyes that held a kind of warmth Daniel had not seen in a very long time. "You're back," she said, wiping her hands on a towel as she walked toward the counter. "Same table?" Daniel nodded, feeling something loosen in his chest that had been tight for hours. Same table. He sat near the window, away from the other customers, a habit he could not break, even in a place like this. Elena brought him water without being asked, and lingered for a moment longer than she needed to. "Rough day?" she asked, studying his face carefully. "Long day," Daniel said, which was as close to the truth as he was willing to give her. Elena tilted her head slightly, as if she wanted to ask more but decided against it. "I'll bring you the usual," she said instead, and walked back toward the kitchen. Daniel watched her go, and for a moment, the image of the man kneeling on the warehouse floor faded from his mind. This was the strange thing about Elena. She had no idea who he was, no idea what his hands had done just hours before he walked through her door, and somehow that made him feel more like himself than anything else in his life. Around her, he was not the boss. He was not the man everyone feared. He was simply a man eating dinner alone, watching a woman who laughed easily and moved through her small restaurant like she owned the whole world. even though the world outside these walls was far more dangerous than she knew. When she brought his food, she sat down across from him for a few minutes, something she had started doing over the past week. The restaurant was quiet, only a few tables occupied, and her brother had already left for the night. She talked about her day, about a supplier who had been late with a delivery, about her plans to expand the menu if business kept improving. Daniel listened more than he spoke, something rare for a man who was used to commanding every room he entered. There was something about her voice, steady and warm, that made him want to sit here for hours and forget the world waiting for him outside. "You never talk about your work," Elena said, breaking a small piece of bread between her fingers. "It's not very interesting," Daniel said carefully. "I doubt that," she said, studying him with those sharp, curious eyes. "You dress like someone important. You have a driver waiting outside every night, and you always look like you're carrying something heavy, even when you're just sitting here eating pasta." Daniel felt a flicker of alarm at how easily she read him, but he kept his expression calm. "I run a business, import and export. It keeps me busy." It was not entirely a lie. His organization did move goods across borders, though most of what crossed those borders was not something Elena would ever want to know about. She studied him a moment longer, as if deciding whether to push further, then let it go with a small smile. "Well, whatever it is, you should let yourself relax sometimes," she said. "You look like you carry the whole city on your shoulders." "Maybe I do," Daniel said quietly, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he almost smiled. They talked until the restaurant closed, and when Daniel finally stood to leave, Elena walked him to the door. The night air was cold, and she wrapped her arms around herself as she stood in the doorway. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked. "I'll be here," Daniel said, and he meant it more than he wanted to admit. He walked to his car, feeling lighter than he had in years, and it was not until he was halfway home that his phone buzzed with a message that pulled him straight back into the world he had just spent 2 hours trying to forget. The message was from Marco, his second in command, a man who had been loyal to the Moretti family since before Daniel was born. "We found something," the message read. "You need to see this tonight." Daniel's jaw tightened. He typed a short reply and told Peter to change direction. Whatever warmth Elena's restaurant had given him faded quickly as the car turned toward the other side of the city, toward the part of his life that never truly let him rest. Marco was waiting for him in a private office above one of the family's nightclubs, a place with thick walls and no windows, built for conversations that needed to stay hidden from the rest of the world. He looked tired, his tie loosened, a folder open on the desk in front of him. "What is it?" Daniel asked, closing the door behind him. Marco slid a photograph across the desk. It was grainy, taken from a distance, but Daniel recognized the face immediately, and his blood went cold. It was Victor Lang, older now, gray at the temples, but unmistakably the same man who had shot his father 10 years ago and vanished into nothing. "Where was this taken?" Daniel asked, his voice low and dangerous. 3 days ago, downtown, near the old shipping docks," Marco said. "One of our contacts spotted him and got a photo before he disappeared into a crowd. We've had people watching that area ever since, but nothing else yet." Daniel stared at the photograph, memories flooding back that he had spent a decade trying to bury. His father's face, pale and lifeless on a hospital gurney, his mother's screams echoing through the hallway, the years of searching, the dead ends, the whispers that Victor might already be dead, whispers Daniel had never believed for a single moment. "He's here," Daniel said quietly. "He's actually here." "It looks that way," Marco said. "What do you want to do?" Daniel set the photograph down slowly, his hands steady, despite the storm building inside him. "Find him. I don't care what it takes or how long it takes. I want to know where he sleeps, where he eats, who he talks to, everything." "Understood," Marco said, though something in his expression looked uncertain. "Daniel, it's been 10 years. Are you sure you want to open this up again? Whatever he was involved in, it's old history now. The organization is stable. We don't need this kind of trouble." Daniel's eyes snapped up, cold and hard. "This isn't about the organization, Marco. This is about my father. This man walked into his restaurant and put 3 bullets in his back, and then he vanished like a coward for 10 years. I have waited a long time for this. I am not letting it go now that he's finally within reach. Marco nodded slowly, recognizing there was no point arguing further. I'll get the team moving tonight. Daniel left the office an hour later. The photograph burned into his memory. As Peter drove him home through the quiet streets, Daniel stared out the window without really seeing anything, his mind replaying the moment his father died over and over, a wound that had never fully closed no matter how many years passed. For a decade, he had built walls around himself, focused entirely on running the organization and keeping his family safe, telling himself that finding Victor Lang no longer mattered as much as it once did. But seeing that photograph tonight proved that was a lie he had told himself. The wound was still open. It had simply been waiting. He thought of Elena then, sitting across from him in her warm little restaurant, laughing about a supplier who was late with tomatoes, completely unaware that the man sharing her table had just ordered a manhunt for his father's killer. The two worlds felt impossibly far apart, and Daniel realized, with a small, uncomfortable ache in his chest, that he wanted to keep them that way. Elena's world was soft and simple and good. His world was neither of those things, and he had no intention of letting the two collide. Over the following days, Daniel split his time between two very different lives. During the day, he worked with Marco and a small team of trusted men, chasing every lead they could find on Victor's whereabouts. They spoke to old contacts, followed whispers through the city's underground network, and slowly began building a picture of where Victor had been hiding and who might be helping him. Each new piece of information sharpened the hunger in Daniel's chest, a hunger he had not felt this strongly in years. In the evenings, he went to Elena's restaurant, and for a few hours, he let himself forget everything else. Their conversations grew longer, more comfortable, filled with easy laughter that surprised him every time it slipped out of his own mouth. Elena told him about her childhood, about growing up in a house full of noise and cooking smells, about her brother who dreamed of turning their little restaurant into something bigger someday. Daniel found himself sharing pieces of his own life too, careful and edited pieces, stories about his father that avoided the darker truths, memories of a childhood that had once been simple before everything changed. One night, as the restaurant emptied and the city outside grew quiet, Elena walked around the counter and sat beside him instead of across from him, closer than she had ever sat before. The air between them felt different, charged with something neither of them had said out loud yet. "I don't know much about you," she said softly, "but I like who you are when you're here." Daniel looked at her, at the soft light catching the edges of her hair, and felt something crack open inside his chest, something he had kept locked away for 10 long years. "I like who I am when I'm here too," he admitted, his voice quieter than he intended. Elena smiled, and for a moment, neither of them said anything else. The silence between them was comfortable, warm, filled with a kind of understanding that words could not have captured. Daniel reached over and took her hand, gently, testing the boundary between them, and Elena did not pull away. Her fingers curled around his, and something settled inside him, something that felt dangerously close to hope. He knew, even as he sat there holding her hand in the quiet restaurant, that he was standing at the edge of two lives that could not exist together. Somewhere across the city, Victor Lang was hiding in the shadows, a debt 10 years unpaid, waiting to be settled. And here, in this warm little restaurant, was a woman who made him feel like the person he used to be before all of it happened, before the guns and the warehouses and the empire built on fear. Daniel did not know yet how much it would cost him to chase both of those things at once. But as he sat there with Elena's hand in his, the photograph of Victor Lang still burning in his mind, he made a silent promise to himself that he would find a way to have both. He would finish what needed to be finished with Victor, and he would keep this fragile, unexpected warmth that Elena had brought into his life. He had no way of knowing, in that quiet moment, how badly that promise would break. Later that night, long after he had left the restaurant and returned to his own apartment, Daniel stood at his window, looking out over the city lights, his phone buzzing with another message from Marco. They had found an address, a small apartment on the west side of the city where Victor had reportedly been seen coming and going over the past week. Daniel stared at the message for a long time before finally responding. "Watch it. Don't move yet. I want to see him myself first." He set the phone down and looked out at the city again, thinking about Elena's smile, the warmth of her hand in his, the way she had looked at him like he was simply a man and nothing more. He thought about Victor Lang, hiding somewhere in that same city, believing perhaps that 10 years was enough time to disappear completely. Daniel closed his eyes and breathed in slowly, feeling the two halves of his life pulling against each other like a rope stretched too tight. Tomorrow, he would return to Elena's restaurant, and he would sit across from her and laugh about small things and let himself forget, just for a few hours, everything waiting for him in the shadows. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a quiet voice warned him that this fragile peace could not last forever. Sooner or later, his two worlds would collide, and when they did, there would be no way to keep Elena safe from what he truly was. He pushed the thought away, telling himself there was still time, that he could handle both, that 10 years of careful control had prepared him for anything. But as he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, the photograph of Victor Lang burned behind his closed eyes, and somewhere beneath that image, faint and persistent, was the memory of Elena's hand in his, warm and trusting, completely unaware of the storm that was quietly beginning to build around her. 3 weeks passed, and Daniel Moretti found himself living a life split cleanly down the middle, like a coin balanced on its edge, never quite falling one way or the other. By day, he chased shadows through the city, following every scrap of information his men could gather about Victor Lang. By night, he sat in Elena's restaurant, holding her hand across the counter, telling himself that he could keep both halves of his life separate forever. He was beginning to understand just how wrong that belief was. The apartment on the west side of the city had turned out to be empty by the time Daniel's men reached it, the walls bare, the closets cleared out, nothing left behind but a faint smell of cigarette smoke and an old newspaper folded on the kitchen counter. Victor had moved again, slipping away just as he had done for the past decade, always one step ahead, always aware that someone might be watching. Daniel had stood in that empty apartment himself, running his fingers along the dusty windowsill, feeling the same cold fury he had felt the night his father died. Victor was close, closer than he had been in 10 years, and Daniel was not about to let him disappear again. "He knows we're looking," Marco said one afternoon, standing in Daniel's office with his arms crossed, worry etched into every line of his face. "That's the only explanation. Nobody moves that fast unless they've been warned." "Then someone is warning him," Daniel said flatly, staring out the window at the city below. "Find out who." Marco hesitated before speaking again. "Daniel, I need to say something, and I need you to actually hear it. This search is starting to eat up resources we should be using elsewhere. Men who should be handling other business are chasing a ghost instead. People are starting to ask questions." "Let them ask," Daniel said, turning to face him, his eyes hard as stone. "I don't care what it costs. I want him found." Marco studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, recognizing there was no point pushing further. He had known Daniel since childhood, had watched him grow from a quiet, thoughtful boy into the man standing before him now, and he understood better than anyone the weight Daniel carried from his father's death. But lately, he had also noticed something else, a restlessness in Daniel that seemed to grow sharper with each passing week, a hunger that no longer seemed entirely healthy. That evening, Daniel arrived at Elena's restaurant later than usual, his mind still tangled in the day's frustrations. Elena noticed immediately, though she said nothing at first, simply setting a plate in front of him and pouring him a glass of wine without being asked. She had learned, over the past few weeks, to read the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes, though she still had no idea what caused it. "Long day again?" she asked, sliding onto the stool beside him. "They're all long days lately," Daniel admitted, rubbing a hand across his face. Elena studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You know, you've been coming here for weeks now, and I still don't really know what you do. Every time I ask, you give me the same vague answer about imports and exports." She said it lightly, but there was a genuine curiosity beneath the teasing tone, a desire to understand the man who had become such a steady presence in her evenings. Daniel felt a flicker of guilt, quick and sharp. "It's complicated," he said, which was the truest thing he could offer her without revealing everything. "My family has been in this business for a long time, It's not always simple. Family business, Elena repeated, nodding slowly. I understand that better than most people. This restaurant was my grandmother's dream before it was mine. Sometimes carrying on a family legacy feels less like a choice and more like a debt you owe to people who aren't even here anymore. Her words struck something deep inside Daniel, closer to the truth of his own life than she could possibly have known. He thought of his father, of the empire built on fear and blood that Daniel had inherited without ever truly choosing it, and for a moment, the weight of everything pressed down on him so heavily that he almost told her everything, right there at the counter, the words rising up in his throat before he swallowed them back down. You're right, he said instead, his voice quieter than before. It does feel like a debt sometimes. Elena reached over and squeezed his hand gently, her touch warm and grounding. Whatever it is, I hope you find some peace with it eventually, she said. Everyone deserves peace. Daniel looked at her, at the sincerity in her eyes, and felt something inside him ache with a longing he had not allowed himself to feel in years. He wanted peace. He wanted, more than almost anything, to sit in this small restaurant every night and let this woman's warmth wash away the coldness that had settled into his bones a decade ago. But peace felt impossibly far away, while Victor Lang was still breathing somewhere in this city, hiding in the shadows, evading justice that Daniel had promised himself he would deliver. Over the following days, Daniel began slipping away from Elena earlier and earlier, making excuses about early meetings or urgent business calls, though the truth was far different. He was spending his nights combing through the city with Marco and his men, chasing leads that seemed to evaporate the moment they got close. A bartender who claimed to have served Victor a week ago, a landlord who remembered renting to a man matching his description under a false name. Each lead brought Daniel a step closer, then slipped away just as quickly, leaving him more frustrated and more consumed than before. Elena noticed the change, though she said nothing for a long while. She noticed the dark circles beneath his eyes, the way his phone buzzed constantly during their dinners, the way he sometimes stepped outside mid-conversation to take calls he refused to explain. She told herself it was simply the pressure of running a business, the same pressure her own brother sometimes carried when supply issues threatened to sink their small restaurant. But a quiet unease had begun to settle in her chest, a feeling she could not quite name. One evening, nearly a month after they had first started sitting together after closing, Elena found herself alone in the restaurant, waiting for Daniel, who had texted that he would be late. She busied herself wiping down tables, glancing at the door every few minutes, until finally, nearly 2 hours after he was supposed to arrive, the door opened, and Daniel walked in, his expression tight and distracted, a fresh cut visible along his knuckles that he tried, unsuccessfully, to hide by keeping his hand in his pocket. What happened to your hand? Elena asked immediately, setting down her cloth and crossing the room toward him. It's nothing, Daniel said quickly, too quickly. Just a work accident. Loading dock, one of the crates shifted wrong. Elena studied his hand carefully, the split skin across his knuckles that looked far more like the result of a fist meeting something solid than any accident involving crates. She did not push further, but the unease in her chest grew heavier, settling like a stone she could not quite swallow. You've been different lately, she said instead, choosing her words carefully. Distracted, distant. I know it's not really my place to ask, but I care about you, Daniel, and I want to understand what's going on. Daniel felt the words hit him like a physical weight. He wanted to tell her everything, wanted to unburden himself of the secret he had carried alone for so long, but the fear of what her reaction might be, the fear of losing the one part of his life that still felt clean and good, kept the words locked behind his teeth. There's a situation from my past that I'm dealing with, he said finally, choosing the truth in its smallest, safest form. Something that happened a long time ago is coming back up. I'm trying to handle it, but it's taking more of my time and attention than I expected. Elena watched him carefully, searching his face for more, but respecting the boundary he had drawn even as it worried her. Is it dangerous? She asked quietly. Daniel hesitated, and that hesitation told her more than any answer could have. I'm handling it, he said again, which was not an answer at all. Elena nodded slowly, though the unease in her chest did not ease. She reached for his injured hand and held it gently between both of hers, careful not to press against the broken skin. "Just be careful," she said softly. "Whatever it is, please be careful." Daniel looked down at her hands wrapped around his, feeling a tenderness that seemed almost unbearable, given everything he had done just hours before arriving at her door. He had spent the evening pressing a frightened contact for information about Victor's movements, and the conversation had turned physical when the man refused to cooperate. Daniel had walked away with the address of a warehouse where Victor supposedly stored equipment, and a split knuckle that Elena was now holding as if it were something precious rather than evidence of the violence he had just committed. "I will," he said, the lie settling uncomfortably in his chest. That night, after leaving Elena's restaurant, Daniel met Marco and two other men outside the warehouse their contact had named. The building sat at the edge of the docks, dark and silent, surrounded by rusted shipping containers and overgrown weeds pushing through cracked concrete. Daniel felt his pulse quicken as they approached, every instinct sharpening the way it always did when he sensed he was close to something important. Inside, the warehouse was mostly empty, filled with dust and shadows, but in one corner, they found evidence that someone had been staying there recently. A cot pushed against the wall, empty food containers, a jacket hanging on a nail, and inside the jacket pocket, a folded piece of paper with a phone number written on it that Marco immediately recognized as belonging to a man connected to a rival organization on the other side of the city. "Victor's working with someone," Marco said, studying the paper carefully. "This changes things. If he has protection from another family, this is going to get a lot more complicated." Daniel stared at the empty cot, imagining Victor sleeping there just hours before, close enough that Daniel could almost feel his presence lingering in the stale air. "I don't care how complicated it gets," Daniel said, his voice low and hard. "I've waited 10 years. I'm not stopping now, because someone else decided to protect him." They left the warehouse with more questions than answers, but Daniel felt something shift inside him that night, a hardening of his resolve that pushed everything else to the edges of his mind. Even as he drove home in the dark, even as he thought briefly of Elena and the warmth of her hands around his injured knuckles, the thought of Victor Lang, protected and hidden somewhere in this city, consumed nearly all the space in his mind. Over the following 2 weeks, Daniel's visits to Elena's restaurant grew shorter and less frequent. He would arrive distracted, his phone constantly buzzing, his eyes scanning the room even when there was nothing to see. Elena tried to bridge the growing distance between them, asking gentle questions, offering quiet comfort, but Daniel remained locked behind walls she could not quite reach, no matter how hard she tried. One night, she asked him directly to stay later, to sit with her the way they used to talk about anything other than whatever was consuming him. Daniel agreed, and for a few hours, it felt almost like it had before. Easy laughter and comfortable silence, Elena's hand resting naturally in his. But even in that quiet moment, Daniel's phone buzzed against the counter, and his eyes flicked toward it instinctively, unable to fully let go of the world waiting for him outside. "You don't have to answer it," Elena said softly, watching him. "I know," Daniel said, though his hand had already reached for the phone before the words left his mouth. He read the message quickly, his jaw tightening as he processed the information. Marco had found another lead, another possible location, another chance to close the distance between himself and the man who had haunted him for a decade. Daniel looked up at Elena, torn between the two lives pulling at him from opposite directions, and for the first time, he felt the true weight of what he might be risking. "I have to go," he said, standing up before he had fully decided to. Elena's expression flickered with disappointment, quickly masked but not quite hidden. "Of course," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Go take care of your business." Daniel paused at the door, looking back at her standing alone in the quiet restaurant, and felt a pull he could not quite explain, a warning whispering somewhere in the back of his mind that he was making a mistake, that every time he chose Victor over Elena, he was chipping away at something fragile and precious that might not survive the damage. But the hunger for justice, for closure, for the 10 years of pain finally being answered, proved stronger than the warning, and Daniel walked out into the night, leaving Elena standing alone beneath the warm yellow lights of her small restaurant, wondering how much longer she could hold on to a man who seemed to be slipping further away with each passing day. As he drove across the city toward whatever new lead awaited him, Daniel told himself this would be the last time, that once he found Victor, once the debt was finally settled, he would return to Elena whole and unburdened, ready to give her the attention and honesty she deserved. He believed it, or told himself he did, unaware that the chase he had begun was already reshaping him into someone Elena might not recognize when it finally ended, someone who had traded pieces of his own heart for a vengeance that showed no signs of bringing him the peace he so desperately sought. The lead turned out to be a small storage unit near the river, rented under a false name 3 months earlier. Daniel and his men worked quietly through the night, cutting the lock and searching every corner by flashlight, careful not to draw attention from the street outside. Inside, they found boxes of old paperwork, shipping records, and a single photograph tucked inside a folder that made Daniel's breath catch in his throat. It showed his father standing beside a much younger Victor, both men smiling, clearly taken years before the betrayal that ended everything. Daniel stared at the image for a long moment, feeling the old grief rise up fresh and raw, as though no time had passed at all since that night in the hospital hallway. "You all right?" Marco asked quietly, watching him from across the unit. "He was smiling," Daniel said, his voice tight. "In this picture, he's smiling right next to my father like they were friends, like family." Marco said nothing, understanding there was nothing to say that would ease the weight of that discovery. They finished searching the unit, finding little else of use, and left before dawn broke over the docks. Daniel kept the photograph, folding it carefully and placing it in his coat pocket, unable to bring himself to leave it behind or destroy it. It felt, in some strange way, like the only proof he had that his father's trust had once been real, even if it had been repaid with betrayal. Driving home that morning, exhausted and hollowed out from another sleepless night, Daniel found himself thinking not of Victor or Gregory or the growing danger surrounding his investigation, but of Elena, asleep somewhere across the city, unaware of how far he had wandered from the promise he intended to keep. He resolved, as the sun rose pale and gray over the skyline, that he would find a way to slow down, to give her the evenings she deserved, even as the pull of his father's memory refused to loosen its grip on him entirely. The lead that pulled Daniel away that night led to a small office above a currency exchange shop on the eastern edge of the city, a place Marco's contact swore was being used to pass messages to Victor Lang. Daniel and his men waited in the shadows across the street for nearly 3 hours before a man finally emerged, glancing nervously in every direction before hurrying down the block. Daniel recognized him instantly from an old photograph. Not Victor himself, but a man named Gregory Hale, who had once worked as a low-level accountant for the Moretti organization, before disappearing the same week Victor did, 10 years ago. He was part of it, Daniel said quietly, watching Gregory disappear around a corner. He helped Victor plan the whole thing. Marco's expression tightened. If Gregory's still alive, and still connected to Victor, that means this wasn't just one man acting alone. "Daniel, this might be bigger than we thought." They followed Gregory carefully over the following days, learning his patterns, his routines, the small apartment where he lived under a different name. Daniel felt the old fury building steadily inside him, sharper now that he understood the betrayal ran deeper than he had ever imagined. His father had not simply been killed by one disgruntled man. He had been betrayed by people close to the family, people who had smiled at Daniel's birthday parties and shaken his father's hand at business dinners, all while planning his murder behind closed doors. The discovery consumed Daniel entirely. He barely slept, spending his nights reviewing old files, cross-referencing names, searching for any thread that might lead him closer to understanding the full scope of what had happened 10 years ago. His visits to Elena's restaurant became rare, brief appearances that left her more confused and worried with each passing week. She had stopped asking questions directly, sensing that whatever answers he might give would only be partial truths, but the distance between them had grown into something she could no longer ignore. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after Daniel had discovered Gregory's involvement, Elena closed the restaurant early and drove across the city to a small park near Daniel's apartment building, hoping to catch him before whatever business consumed his nights pulled him away again. She waited on a bench near the entrance, watching the sun sink behind the buildings, until finally she saw his car pull into the lot, Peter stepping out to open the door for him. Daniel froze when he saw her sitting there, surprise and something like guilt flickering across his face, before he composed himself and walked toward her. "Elena, what are you doing here?" he asked, glancing around instinctively, a habit that had become second nature over the past few weeks. "I wanted to see you," she said simply, standing up from the bench. "You've barely been to the restaurant in weeks, Daniel. I miss you. And honestly, I'm worried about you." Daniel felt the familiar tug of guilt pulling at his chest, but beneath it, something colder and more urgent, the constant awareness that Gregory Hale might slip away at any moment if he did not act quickly. "I know," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I know I've been distant. This situation I mentioned, it's more complicated than I expected. I'm trying to resolve it as quickly as I can." "What situation?" Elena asked, her voice firmer than before. "Daniel, I've given you space because I trust you, but I can't keep doing this if you won't tell me anything. I don't even know what I'm worried about. I just know something is wrong." Daniel looked at her standing there in the fading evening light, her arms crossed against the evening chill, worry etched clearly across her face, and felt the walls he had built around himself begin to crack under the weight of her honesty. He wanted, more than almost anything, to tell her the truth, to let her see all of him, instead of the careful, edited version he had been offering for weeks. But fear held him back. Fear that the truth would drive her away faster than his silence ever could. "My father was murdered 10 years ago," he said finally, the words coming out slower than he intended, heavier than he expected. "The man who did it disappeared, and I've spent years trying to find him. Recently, we discovered he's back in the city, and there are others involved too, people I trusted who betrayed my family. I'm trying to understand the whole situation before I decide what to do about it." Elena's expression softened with shock and sympathy, though the worry in her eyes did not fade. "Daniel, I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I had no idea. That explains so much." She paused, studying him carefully. "But what exactly do you mean by deciding what to do about it? What are you planning?" Daniel hesitated, aware that he had already revealed more than he intended, unwilling to cross the line into the darker truth of what deciding what to do about it actually meant within his world. "I need justice," he said carefully. "For my father. That's all I can really say." "Justice through the police?" Elena asked, though something in her tone suggested she already suspected the answer would not be that simple. Daniel did not answer immediately, and his silence spoke volumes. Elena studied his face, searching for something, and slowly, painfully, pieces began falling into place that she had been avoiding for weeks. The late nights, the injured knuckles, the constant tension. The way certain men who dropped by the restaurant sometimes to speak with him lowered their voices and glanced around nervously, the way Daniel always paid in cash and never seemed concerned about the amount. "Daniel," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, "what kind of business does your family actually run?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and unavoidable. Daniel felt his heart pounding, aware that this moment might determine everything that came after it. He could lie again, could offer another vague, careful answer that protected the fragile peace between them a little longer, or he could tell her the truth and risk losing her entirely. "It's not simple," he said finally, choosing his words with painful precision. "My family has been involved in certain kinds of business for a long time, things that exist outside what most people would consider legitimate. I inherited that when my father died, and I've spent 10 years running it, because I didn't see another choice." Elena took a step back, her arms wrapping tighter around herself as understanding settled over her features, cold and unwelcome. "You mean you're involved in organized crime?" she said quietly, not quite a question. Daniel did not answer, but his silence confirmed everything she needed to know. Elena stood there for a long moment, processing the revelation, her mind racing back through every strange detail she had noticed and dismissed over the past 2 months. Every warning sign she had chosen to ignore, because she liked the way Daniel made her feel too much to question it too closely. "I need time to think," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to keep it steady. "This is a lot, Daniel. This is more than I expected." "I understand," Daniel said, though panic was beginning to claw at his chest, a feeling he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. "Elena, please, just know that whatever I am in that world, it's not who I am with you. What we have is real." Elena looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, torn between the warmth she genuinely felt for this man and the fear that had just settled into her chest like a stone. "I hope that's true," she said softly. "But I need to think, Daniel. I need some time." She turned and walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing alone in the darkening park, the weight of his confession settling heavily over him. Daniel watched her go, every instinct telling him to follow her, to explain further, to fix whatever damage he had just caused, but he forced himself to stay still, recognizing that pushing her now would only make things worse. He returned to his car in silence, and Peter, sensing his mood, said nothing as they drove back toward the apartment. Daniel stared out the window, replaying the conversation over and over, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake by telling her the truth, or if the greater mistake had been waiting so long to be honest with her in the first place. His phone buzzed as they pulled into the parking garage, another message from Marco. Gregory Hale had been spotted again, this time meeting with two unfamiliar men near the docks, a meeting that lasted nearly an hour before they all left in separate directions. Daniel read the message twice, feeling the familiar pull of obligation and hunger dragging him back toward the hunt, even as thoughts of Elena's tearful expression lingered painfully in his mind. He typed a quick reply, telling Marco to keep watching, to gather more information before they made any moves. Then he sat in the back of the car for a long moment, phone still in hand, torn between two urgent needs that seemed increasingly impossible to satisfy at the same time. He needed to find Victor Lang and finally close the wound that had haunted him for a decade. And he needed, desperately, to find a way to convince Elena that despite everything she had just learned about him, what existed between them was worth holding on to. The next morning, Daniel visited his mother, something he did rarely, though her small house on the quiet side of the city always felt like the one place untouched by the world he had built. She greeted him at the door with the same tired warmth she always carried, her hair now more gray than dark, her hands still bearing the faint marks of years spent cooking for a family that had grown smaller with time. "You look thin," she said, pulling him into a hug before he could even step inside. "Come, sit. I made soup." Daniel sat at the kitchen table where he had eaten breakfast every morning of his childhood, and for a while, neither of them spoke of anything difficult. His mother asked about the restaurant she knew he had been visiting, though she did not yet know Elena's name, only that her son had mentioned a woman who made him smile, in a way she had not seen since before his father died. "There's something I need to tell you," Daniel finally said, setting down his spoon. "We found him, Victor. He's back in the city." His mother's face went still, the color draining slightly from her cheeks. She set her own spoon down carefully, folding her hands together on the table. "After all these years," she said quietly, "I had almost convinced myself we would never know." "I'm going to finish this," Daniel said. "I need you to know that. I'm going to make sure he answers for what he did." His mother studied him for a long moment, her eyes older and wiser than her years, carrying a grief that had never fully healed, but had softened into something quieter over time. "Your father would not want you to lose yourself chasing this," she said gently. "He was proud of many things, Daniel, but he was proudest of the man he hoped you would become, not a man ruled by vengeance." Daniel absorbed her words in silence, unable to fully argue against them, though the hunger inside him had not lessened. He left her house an hour later with her warning lingering in his mind, a warning that echoed, in its own way, the same fear Elena had expressed weeks before. Two women who loved him, both worried that his pursuit of the past might cost him everything meaningful in his present. Over the following days, Daniel gave Elena the space she had asked for, though every hour apart from her felt like a slow, gnawing ache he had not expected to feel so intensely. He threw himself into the hunt for Victor and Gregory, working alongside Marco and his men late into the night, following every lead with an intensity that bordered on obsession. They tracked Gregory's movements carefully, mapping out his routines, learning the names of the men he met with regularly, slowly building a picture of an operation more complex and dangerous than Daniel had initially realized. Late one night, nearly a week after the confrontation in the park, Daniel's phone rang unexpectedly. It was Elena. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. "Not at the restaurant, somewhere private." Daniel felt his heart leap with a mixture of hope and anxiety. "Of course," he said quickly. "Anywhere you want." They agreed to meet at a small cafe near her apartment the following evening, a neutral space away from both of their usual worlds. Daniel arrived early, nervous in a way he had not felt in years, watching the door until Elena walked in, wrapped in a soft gray coat, her expression difficult to read. She sat down across from him and was quiet for a long moment before finally speaking. "I've thought about everything you told me," she said, "and I won't pretend it doesn't scare me, Daniel. It does. The world you live in is dangerous, and I've spent my whole life trying to build something safe and simple. What you're involved in is the opposite of that." Daniel nodded slowly, bracing himself for what he feared might come next. "I understand," he said quietly. "If you need to walk away, I won't blame you." Elena studied him for a long moment, something soft and conflicted moving across her face. "But I also can't stop thinking about how you make me feel," she continued. "The man who sits across from me at that counter every night, who listens when I talk about ridiculous things like tomato suppliers, who held my hand like it mattered. That man doesn't feel like a lie, Daniel. I don't think he is a lie." "He isn't," Daniel said firmly, leaning forward slightly. "Elena, that man is who I really am. Everything else, the business, the danger, all of it exists because of circumstances I didn't choose. But what I feel for you, that's real. That's the realest thing in my life right now." Elena's eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the table, taking his hand the way she had done so many times before. "I want to believe that," she whispered. "I want to try, Daniel, but I need you to promise me something. I need you to be honest with me from now on. No more hiding things, no more vague answers. If we're going to try this, I need to actually know you, all of you, even the parts that scare me." Daniel squeezed her hand gently, relief and gratitude flooding through him in equal measure. "I promise," he said, meaning it with every part of himself. "I'll be honest with you. I don't want to lose you, Elena. I don't think I realized how much I needed this, needed you, until I thought I might lose it." They sat together in the small cafe for hours that night, talking more openly than they ever had before, Daniel sharing pieces of his life he had never spoken aloud to anyone outside his organization. Elena listened carefully, asking questions, absorbing the weight of his world with a steadiness that surprised him. By the time they finally left the cafe, something between them felt renewed, stronger perhaps for having survived its first real test. But even as Daniel walked Elena to her car that night, promising to see her the following evening, his phone buzzed once more in his pocket. Another message from Marco, with new information about Gregory Hale's growing network. Daniel glanced at the screen, felt the familiar pull of obligation tightening around his chest, and realized, with a flicker of unease, that the promise he had just made to Elena would be far harder to keep than he wanted to admit. The hunt for Victor Lang was far from over, and somewhere deep down, Daniel knew that keeping both his word to Elena and his obsession with the past intact would require a balance he was not entirely certain he could maintain. For 2 weeks after the conversation in the small cafe, Daniel kept his promise to Elena as best as he could manage. He told her when meetings ran late instead of disappearing into silence. He explained, in careful terms, when his work required him to step away from their evenings together. Elena, in turn, tried to accept the strange rhythm of loving a man whose world operated so differently from her own, though the fear never fully left her, sitting quietly in the back of her mind, like a shadow she could not shake. The investigation into Gregory Hale had grown more complicated than Daniel anticipated. Marco's men had discovered that Gregory was not simply passing messages for Victor. He had built his own small network over the past decade, running a modest but profitable operation that moved stolen goods through the docks, under the protection of a rival family, led by a man named Callahan, a name that carried weight and danger in the city's underworld. If Victor was truly connected to Callahan's organization, going after him directly would mean risking a conflict far larger than Daniel had initially planned for. "We need to think carefully about this," Marco said one afternoon, spreading a series of photographs and notes across Daniel's desk. If we move against Gregory, and it leads back to Callahan, we're not just settling an old score anymore. We're starting a war with an organization twice the size of ours. Daniel studied the photographs carefully, his jaw tight with restrained frustration. I don't care about the size of his organization, he said. I care about finishing what I started 10 years ago. I understand that, Marco said, his voice patient but firm. But you have people depending on you now, Daniel. Men who trust you to protect this family, not throw it into a war over something personal. I'm not saying give up on Victor. I'm saying we need to be smart about how we do this. Daniel knew Marco was right, even as every instinct in him rebelled against the caution. He forced himself to slow down, to plan more carefully, gathering intelligence for another week before deciding on their next move. During that week, he tried harder than ever to give Elena the attention she deserved, showing up at the restaurant most evenings, sitting with her long after closing, slowly rebuilding the trust that had been shaken weeks earlier. One evening, as they sat together at the counter, Elena reached into her bag and pulled out a small folded paper, sliding it across to him with a shy smile. My brother finally agreed to let me expand the menu, she said. I've been working on new recipes for weeks. I wanted you to be the first to try them. Daniel unfolded the paper, a handwritten list of dishes in Elena's neat script, and felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the food itself. I'm honored, he said, smiling in a way that felt unfamiliar but good. When do I get to try them? Tomorrow night, Elena said, her eyes bright with excitement. I'm testing 3 new dishes. You'll be my only customer, so you better have good things to say. Daniel laughed, a real laugh, rare and unguarded. I promise to be honest, he said, then paused, catching the echo of the promise he had made her weeks earlier, a promise about honesty that extended far beyond simple opinions about food. Elena caught the look on his face and reached for his hand, squeezing it gently, understanding without needing him to explain. The following evening, Daniel arrived at the restaurant early, eager for the private dinner Elena had promised him. The restaurant was closed to other customers, warm candlelight replacing the usual overhead lights, and the smell of something rich and delicious drifting from the kitchen. Elena greeted him with a bright smile, more relaxed and joyful than he had seen her in weeks, and for a few hours, they sat together tasting new dishes, laughing over small mistakes in her recipes, talking about everything and nothing at all. It was, Daniel would later think, one of the best nights of his life, a night that felt entirely separate from the darkness waiting for him outside these walls. But even that peace could not last. As Elena cleared the final plates and Daniel helped carry glasses to the kitchen sink, his phone buzzed insistently in his pocket, an emergency tone that Marco only used when something urgent had happened. Daniel answered immediately, his relaxed expression vanishing in an instant. What's wrong? We have a problem, Marco said, his voice tight with tension. Someone tried to break into the restaurant supply warehouse tonight. Our men caught 2 of them, but they're saying Callahan sent them, that this was a message. They know we've been investigating Gregory. They know about the connection to Victor. Daniel, I think they're trying to warn us off before things escalate. Daniel's stomach dropped, his mind racing through the implications. If Callahan's people were sending warnings, it meant they viewed Daniel's investigation as a genuine threat, which meant Victor's protection ran even deeper than they had suspected. Where are they now? He asked, already moving toward the door. At the warehouse. We're holding them until you get here. I'm on my way, Daniel said, ending the call and turning to find Elena watching him with a familiar, weary expression, the joy from moments earlier already fading from her face. You have to go, she said quietly, not quite a question. I'm sorry, Daniel said, guilt twisting sharply in his chest. This can't wait. It's about the situation I told you about. Elena nodded slowly, wrapping her arms around herself. I know, she said. Just, please, be careful. Whatever this is, please don't let it consume you completely. Daniel crossed the room and pulled her into a brief, tight embrace, pressing a kiss to the top of her head before pulling away. I'll call you tomorrow, he promised, and then he was gone, leaving Elena standing alone in her restaurant once more, the warm candlelight suddenly feeling much colder than before. At the warehouse, Daniel found two men zip-tied to chairs, bruised but conscious, Marco standing over them with barely restrained anger. Daniel questioned them himself, his voice cold and controlled despite the fury building beneath the surface. The men eventually admitted, after significant pressure, that Callahan had ordered the break-in, specifically to send a message, confirming that Victor Lang was indeed under Callahan's protection, valuable to him, for reasons the two men claimed not to fully understand. "Why would Callahan protect a man who murdered my father?" Daniel demanded, standing over one of the men, his patience worn dangerously thin. The man hesitated, fear flickering across his face. "Because Victor works for him now," he finally admitted, "has for years. He's good at what he does. Callahan's not going to hand him over just because you want revenge for something that happened a decade ago." Daniel felt something cold settle over him, a grim clarity replacing the chaotic fury that had been building for weeks. Victor was not simply hiding. He was protected, valued, useful to a man powerful enough to challenge Daniel's own organization if pushed too hard. Getting to him would require more than careful investigation. It would require a confrontation Daniel had been trying to avoid, one that risked far more than his personal vendetta. He left the warehouse well past midnight, his mind heavy with the implications of what he had learned. Marco walked beside him toward the car, his expression grave. "Daniel, we need to talk about this seriously," he said. "If Callahan is protecting Victor, going after him directly means declaring war on an organization that could seriously hurt us. I need to know you understand what that means before we go any further." "I understand," Daniel said quietly, though the weight of the decision pressed down on him harder than he wanted to admit. "Then we need to plan this carefully," Marco continued. "No more rushing into things. If we're doing this, we do it smart, or we don't do it at all." Daniel nodded, though sleep did not come easily that night. He lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, weighing the cost of pursuing Victor against everything else at stake, including the fragile happiness he had found with Elena. He thought of her standing in the candlelit restaurant, watching him leave once again, the disappointment carefully hidden, but not entirely absent from her eyes. He thought of his father, 3 bullets in the back, a decade of grief that had never fully healed. Both truths pulled at him with equal force, and Daniel realized, somewhere in the depths of that sleepless night, that he might not be able to hold on to both without losing something precious in the process. The following days brought careful planning, meetings held in whispered tones behind closed doors, alliances tested and strengthened as Daniel prepared for whatever confrontation lay ahead. He tried to maintain his promise to Elena, showing up when he could, calling when he could not, but the strain of preparing for a potential conflict with Callahan's organization left him distracted and exhausted in ways he could not fully hide. Elena noticed, of course. She always noticed, but she said little, choosing instead to offer quiet support, small gestures of comfort, that Daniel clung to like a lifeline during those tense, uncertain days. She packed him food when he mentioned skipping meals. She sent short messages during the day, simple reminders that she was thinking of him, that she was still there despite the growing weight pressing down on their relationship. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the warehouse incident, Daniel arrived at Elena's restaurant later than usual, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. Elena took one look at him and guided him to a booth in the back, away from the few remaining customers, sitting close beside him without a word. "You don't have to talk about it," she said softly, resting her head against his shoulder. "I just want you to know I'm here." Daniel closed his eyes, letting the warmth of her presence settle over him like a balm against the sharp edges of everything else in his life. "I don't deserve you," he murmured, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Elena lifted her head, studying him with a gentle, steady gaze. "Don't say that," she said firmly. "You're a good man caught in complicated circumstances. I see that, Daniel, even when you don't see it yourself." Daniel wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer, wishing he could freeze this moment forever, wishing the storm building on the horizon of his life could somehow pass them by entirely. But even as he held her, his phone remained heavy in his pocket, a constant reminder that the conflict he had set into motion would not wait much longer, and that the choices he made in the coming days would determine not only his own fate, but potentially Elena's as well. He did not yet know how right that fear would prove to be, or how quickly the fragile peace they had built together was about to shatter beneath the weight of everything Daniel had chosen to chase. The next afternoon, Marco called an emergency meeting with the small circle of men Daniel trusted most, laying out a careful plan to approach Gregory Hale directly, hoping to pressure him into revealing exactly where Victor was staying and how deeply Callahan's protection actually extended. It was a risky move, one that required patience and precision, qualities Daniel forced himself to summon despite the restlessness clawing at his chest. They tracked Gregory to a quiet apartment building on the edge of downtown, watching his patterns for 3 full days before finally approaching him alone one evening as he returned from a nearby market, grocery bags in hand. Gregory froze the moment he recognized Daniel's face, the bags slipping from his fingers and scattering across the sidewalk. "I don't want trouble," Gregory said quickly, his hands raised slightly. "Whatever you think I did, I was just following orders back then. I was young. I didn't have a choice." "You had a choice," Daniel said coldly, stepping closer. "You chose to help the man who murdered my father, and then you chose to disappear for 10 years instead of facing what you did. Now you're going to tell me everything you know about Victor, or I promise you, this conversation will not end well for you." Gregory's composure cracked under the weight of Daniel's presence, years of guilt and fear spilling out in a rush of information. He explained how Victor had approached him years ago with an opportunity to work for Callahan, how the older man had grown valuable to the organization through his skill with logistics and his willingness to disappear into the background whenever necessary. He gave them an address, a small apartment above a laundromat, where Victor had reportedly been staying for the past several weeks, careful and quiet, believing himself safely hidden beneath Callahan's protection. Daniel absorbed the information with a strange, cold calm, the years of searching finally converging into something concrete and real. He thanked Gregory with a warning that carried more weight than words, then walked away, leaving the trembling man alone on the sidewalk among his scattered groceries. That night, Daniel stood outside the laundromat for nearly an hour, staring up at the lit window on the second floor, wondering if Victor was standing just beyond that glass, unaware how close his decade of hiding had finally come to ending. Every instinct screamed at Daniel to go up immediately, to finally face the man who had haunted his nightmares for 10 years. But Marco's warning about Callahan's protection held him back, a fragile thread of caution stretched thin against the overwhelming pull of vengeance so close within reach. The call came at 3 in the morning, tearing Daniel from a restless sleep, with a violence that left his heart pounding before he even understood the words being spoken. It was Elena, her voice trembling, barely coherent through what sounded like tears and fear tangled together. "Daniel, someone was here," she said, her words rushing out in a panicked stream. "2 men came into the restaurant after I closed. They said they had a message for you. Daniel, I'm so scared." Daniel was already out of bed, pulling on clothes with shaking hands, his mind racing through every possible scenario. "Are you hurt, Elena? Are you hurt?" No, I'm okay," she said, though her voice betrayed how far from okay she truly felt. "They didn't touch me. They said if you didn't back off, if you kept looking for Victor, next time, it wouldn't just be a warning. Daniel, they knew my name. They knew where I live. How did they know all of that?" Daniel felt his blood turn to ice, a rage unlike anything he had felt in years, building rapidly beneath his fear. Callahan had found Elena, had used her, an innocent woman, with no connection to his world beyond loving him, as a weapon against him. The realization hit him with devastating clarity. Everything he had feared, every warning he had ignored in his relentless pursuit of Victor, had just become horrifyingly real. "I'm coming to you right now," Daniel said, already moving toward his car. "Stay inside. Lock everything. I'll be there in 15 minutes. He broke every speed limit getting across the city, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his mind consumed with a single thought. He had done this. His obsession, his refusal to slow down or step back, had put Elena directly in danger, had shattered the wall he had promised himself he would keep between his 2 worlds. When he arrived at her apartment, Elena opened the door before he could knock, her face pale and streaked with tears, and Daniel pulled her into his arms without a word, holding her as tightly as he could while she trembled against him. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice rough with guilt and fear. "Elena, I am so sorry. This is my fault. I should have stepped back weeks ago." Elena pulled back slightly, looking up at him with an expression that mixed fear with something harder, something that had not been there before. "They knew everything about me, Daniel," she said, her voice steadier now, though still shaking. "My work schedule, where I live, what I look like. This isn't just about you anymore. My life is actually in danger because of decisions you made." "I know," Daniel said quietly, unable to argue against the truth of her words. "I'll fix this. I promise you, I will fix this." "How?" Elena asked, stepping back further, putting distance between them that felt far more significant than the physical space alone. "How exactly do you fix something like this, Daniel? By escalating things further? By starting a war that puts even more people in danger?" Daniel had no immediate answer, the weight of her question settling heavily over him. He had spent weeks convincing himself he could balance both halves of his life, that his pursuit of Victor could exist alongside his relationship with Elena without one destroying the other. Tonight had proven, in the most terrifying way possible, exactly how wrong that belief had been. "I need to make sure you're safe," he said finally. "I can have men watching your apartment, the restaurant, anywhere you go. I can protect you, Elena." "By turning my life into something that needs protecting in the first place," Elena said, her voice breaking slightly. "Daniel, I love you. I do. But I can't live like this. I can't have men following me to keep me safe from a war that has nothing to do with me. This isn't the life I want. This was never the life I wanted." Daniel felt something inside him crack, a fear far deeper than anything Callahan's threats had caused. "Elena, please," he said, his voice pleading in a way that was foreign to him. "I'll stop. I'll walk away from the search for Victor. I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe and keep you here with me." Elena looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for the truth of his words, wanting desperately to believe them. "Can you actually do that?" she asked quietly. "Can you really walk away from something you've spent 10 years chasing?" "Because I don't think you can, Daniel. I think this has become part of who you are, and I don't think you know how to let it go, even for me." Daniel wanted to argue, wanted to prove her wrong with absolute certainty, but the words caught in his throat, because some deep, honest part of him feared she might be right. The hunger for justice, for closure regarding his father's death, had driven him for so long that he genuinely did not know if he could simply set it aside, even with everything he stood to lose. "I need time," Elena said softly, tears spilling down her cheeks once more. "I need to think about what's right for me, Daniel. I can't make this decision tonight, not with everything still so raw." "Okay," Daniel said, forcing himself to accept her need for space, even as every instinct screamed at him to fight harder, to convince her to stay. "I'll have someone watch the building tonight, just for your safety. Please, just let me do that much." Elena nodded slowly, too exhausted and frightened to argue further. Daniel arranged for 2 of his most trusted men to watch her apartment through the night, then reluctantly left, driving home through empty streets with a hollow ache in his chest that felt worse than anything Victor Lang had ever caused him. The following days passed in a blur of tension and uncertainty. Daniel threw himself into damage control, meeting with Marco to discuss how deeply Callahan's organization had penetrated their operations, how they had managed to identify and locate Elena so quickly. The answers were troubling. Callahan had clearly been watching Daniel for weeks, tracking his movements, identifying anyone close to him who might be used as leverage. It was a level of surveillance that spoke to just how seriously Callahan viewed the threat Daniel posed to his protection of Victor. "We need to end this," Marco said during one tense meeting, exhaustion evident in his voice. "Either we go all in against Callahan, which means real war, real losses, or we find another way to close this chapter without dragging everyone we care about into the crossfire." Daniel sat in silence, staring at the photographs spread across his desk, Victor's face staring back at him from the grainy image taken weeks ago. He thought of his father, of the promise he had made himself a decade ago to find justice no matter the cost. He thought of Elena, frightened and shaken, questioning whether she could build a life with a man who seemed unable to let go of his past, even when it threatened everything good in his present. "What if there's another option?" Daniel said slowly, an idea forming even as he spoke it aloud. What if instead of going after Victor directly, we find another way to resolve this? Information exchanged for peace. If Callahan believes protecting Victor is more trouble than it's worth, maybe there's a path forward that doesn't require open war. Marco considered this carefully. It's worth exploring, he admitted. But Daniel, are you sure you're ready to consider a resolution that doesn't involve you personally confronting Victor? After everything, after 10 years, can you actually accept an ending that isn't exactly what you always imagined? Daniel thought of Elena's words, the fear in her voice, the hollow ache that had settled in his chest since she asked for space. He thought of the life he wanted, a life that included warmth and laughter, and a future built on something more than vengeance. I think I have to be ready, he said quietly, because the alternative is losing everything that actually matters. Over the following week, Daniel worked carefully with Marco to open indirect channels of communication with Callahan's organization, seeking a resolution that would satisfy his need for answers without triggering the full-scale conflict everyone feared. It was delicate, dangerous work, requiring patience. Daniel had rarely shown throughout his relentless pursuit of Victor, but slowly, cautiously, progress began to form. During this time, Daniel gave Elena the space she had asked for, though every day apart from her felt heavier than the last. He did not call constantly or push for answers, understanding that pressuring her would only confirm her fears about the life he led. Instead, he focused on proving through his actions that he was capable of change, that he could prioritize safety and peace over blind pursuit of vengeance. Nearly 2 weeks after the terrifying night at her apartment, Elena reached out to him, asking to meet at the small park where they had first spoken honestly about his family's business. Daniel arrived early, nervous in a way that reminded him of the uncertain days before their relationship had truly begun. Elena arrived shortly after, her expression calmer than it had been during their last difficult conversation, though still guarded. I've had a lot of time to think, she said, sitting beside him on the same bench where everything had changed weeks earlier. About us. About what happened. About what kind of life I actually want. Daniel waited, his heart pounding, afraid of what she might say next. I understand if you've decided this is too much, he said quietly. I would never blame you for choosing safety over uncertainty. Elena shook her head slowly. That's not exactly where I landed, she said. I talked to my brother. I talked to a few close friends. And honestly, Daniel, I talked to myself more than anyone else, trying to understand what I actually feel versus what fear is telling me to feel. And what did you decide? Daniel asked, barely daring to hope. I decided that I love you, Elena said softly, meeting his eyes directly. But I also decided that love isn't enough on its own, if it comes with constant fear for my safety. I need to know that you're actually willing to change, not just say the words, but actually show me through your choices that our life together matters more than settling old scores. Daniel reached for her hand, relief and determination flooding through him in equal measure. I've already started, he said, and he told her about the careful negotiations with Callahan's organization, about choosing a path that prioritized peace over pure vengeance, about recognizing that holding on to her mattered more than any victory he might claim by finally confronting Victor directly. Elena listened carefully, searching his face for sincerity, and slowly, something in her expression softened. That's a start, she said quietly. But I need you to understand something, Daniel. Even if this situation resolves peacefully, your world will always carry risks I'm not used to. I need you to promise me that you'll keep choosing this path, choosing safety and honesty, even after this immediate danger passes. I promise, Daniel said, and this time, the words carried a weight and certainty that had been missing from his earlier promises. Elena, chasing Victor cost me nearly everything that actually matters. I understand that now in a way I didn't before. I'm not going to make that mistake again. 3 weeks later, the careful negotiations Daniel and Marco had pursued finally reached a resolution. Callahan, unwilling to risk an unnecessary war over a man whose usefulness had begun to fade, agreed to a quiet arrangement. Victor would be exiled from the city permanently, stripped of protection, forced to disappear once more, this time with the understanding that any return would mean immediate consequences from both organizations. It was not the justice Daniel had originally sought, Not the confrontation he had imagined for 10 long years, but it was an ending, a closure of sorts, that finally allowed him to release the weight he had carried since his father's death. Daniel stood at the docks the night Victor was escorted out of the city, watching from a distance, as the man who had haunted his nightmares for a decade climbed into an unmarked car and disappeared into the darkness one final time. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a quiet, hollow relief that it was finally over, that he could stop looking over his shoulder, stop letting the past consume every part of his present. He returned to Elena's restaurant that night, finding her closing up alone. And when she saw his face, she seemed to understand immediately that something had shifted, that the storm he had been chasing for so long had finally passed. "It's done," Daniel said simply, crossing the room to stand before her. "Victor is gone, really gone this time. There won't be any more late-night calls, any more danger following me home." Elena studied his face carefully, searching for the truth of his words, and slowly, a genuine smile spread across her features, warm and relieved. "How do you feel?" she asked softly. Daniel considered the question seriously, surprised by his own answer. "Lighter," he said finally. "For the first time in 10 years, I actually feel lighter." Elena stepped closer, wrapping her arms around him, and Daniel held her tightly, breathing in the familiar warmth of her presence, grateful beyond words that he had not lost her entirely to the darkness he had chased for so long. "I'm proud of you," she whispered against his chest. "For choosing us, for choosing peace." They stood together in the quiet restaurant for a long while, the weight of the past finally beginning to lift, replaced slowly by the fragile, hopeful possibility of a future neither of them had been certain they would get to share. Daniel knew the road ahead would not be simple. His world still carried dangers Elena would need to learn to navigate, and rebuilding the trust that had been shaken over the past months would take time and patience from them both. But standing there, holding the woman who had shown him that peace was worth fighting for even more than vengeance, Daniel finally understood what his father would have wanted for him all along. Not endless pursuit of justice through violence, but the courage to choose love, even when it meant letting go of the past that had defined him for so long. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm of noise and light, indifferent to the quiet transformation happening within the small restaurant's warm walls. But for Daniel Moretti, a man who had spent a decade chasing shadows, the true victory was not found in finally confronting his father's killer. It was found in learning, painfully and slowly, that some battles were worth ending, and some people were worth choosing, again and again, over the ghosts of everything left behind.